Welcome to the Gary Null Show, a program designed to enhance mental, physical, and spiritual well-being through science and the wisdom of the ages. Let us take you on a journey of empowerment. Sit back, relax, and get ready to change your life for good.
Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null. I'd like to welcome you to the Gary Null Show. We show more in-depth, original investigative reports on health and environmental issues than any other television program in the United States. Today, continuing part 3 of Fatal Fallout, and this is information we all need to know.
The government has had to make us believe that the radiation emitted either from the bomb tests or from the normally permitted releases from nuclear plants are so low that they could not result in detectable effects on human health. And that is an outright lie, because study after study for the last 4 or 5 decades have shown that people living near nuclear reactors or downwind from the bomb test site had much higher incidence of diseases and death than people living elsewhere. And all this has been available for decades, and it was kept from the public because of the need to use and threaten the use of nuclear weapons.
Near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, an accident at a nuclear power plant. A spokesman said that a feed water pump broke down this morning, automatically shutting down the 3-mile nuclear power plant. Some radiated steam escaped into the atmosphere before the plant could be sealed off, but officials said there is no threat to health.
The tragedy of 3 Mile Island was, of course, that it did not explode in a visible way the way Chernobyl did. Then everyone would have been warned and people would have evacuated and so on. But instead it was a gradual, part meltdown that didn't go all the way Chernobyl did. And as a result, radioactive gases came out, but not so instantly, and there was no fire to warn people. And as a result, the governor hesitated for a few days to order evacuation of pregnant women and children, which I had recommended at the time when I was there together with George Wald on the day after the accident. I urged women and children to leave, but many didn't because you couldn't smell it, you couldn't see it, and the utility lied about it. They didn't want to admit that they had a major meltdown. And that caused many more children all over the Northeast, in Pennsylvania, New York, and all the way up to England, to New England, and across to Europe and Wales and England, to be affected by the radioactive gases that have silently escaped. And nobody died at 3 Mile Island, according to the government.
There's a controversy about 3 Mile Island. Some people say that you can see an increase in birth defects, an increase in spontaneous abortions. Other people say no such thing. Almost no radiation came out of 3 Mile Island, and therefore it's just anecdotal data.
Every effort will be made to keep those radiation levels down to the present state, which is quite safe for all concerned.
The truth of the matter is, we don't really know. We know, for example, that about 13 million curies of xenon gas came out of that reactor.
The radiation levels are being very carefully monitored throughout the area.
But if you look at the data from Wednesday evening to Saturday of March of 1979, you realize that the dosimeters were not in place from Wednesday to Saturday in many of these areas. In other words, for 3 days, radiation was pouring out of the reactor, and we did not have the dosimetry in place to be able to calculate reliably how much radioactive gas came out. In other words, it's like corralling the horses after the horses have escaped.
At the present time, all those who are involved here who are highly qualified tell me that the reactor core is indeed stable.
Criminal charges have been levied by the NRC against the operators at 3 Mile Island for forging the test scores of workers because the workers have routinely flunked the exam. It was nothing but one button, the PORV button, one button that set off a multi-billion-dollar accident.
Public statistics were altered in order to hide what was going on. Initially, nobody believed that there would be a significant effect on human health, and therefore the initial monthly vital statistics reported by the government agencies showed a rise in infant mortality in the next few months that was totally unusual, which then declined again and ended about 10 months later. This happened both in Maryland and New York and Pennsylvania. And then, since I was studying the monthly statistics at the time, and also looked at the final printed version in the bound volume of the vital statistics, I found that the bump that had occurred in the monthly statistics was wiped out and had been distributed over other months so that there wouldn't be a spike seen in the number of babies that died after 3 Mile Island.
I received a fax some years ago from Jane Rickover, who was the daughter-in-law of Admiral Rickover, who was Jimmy Carter's advisor. Jimmy worked with Admiral Rickover in the US Navy. Rickover convinced Carter to cover up the data on the accident at 3 Mile Island because he said if the public found out how really serious it had been, it would have meant the end of the civilian nuclear power industry. At the end of his life, when he was dying, Rickover recanted to his daughter-in-law, Jane, and said he wished he'd never done that and encouraged the cover-up.
There is no question that someone intentionally changed the statistics on infant mortality in the United States shortly after 3 Mile Island, and it is essentially a criminal act.
I think when you're dealing with Jimmy Carter and the 3 Mile Island accident, you have to realize that he was both a nuclear engineer, and so he knew some of the dangers of the situation, but he was also commander-in-chief of the military, and so he walked a tightrope on this.
Careful preparations are being made. Every eventuality is being assessed. And above all, the health and safety of people involved will be paramount.
He did cover up the human health problems at 3 Mile Island.
The work that I'm best known for is the work that I did on 3 Mile Island. And I didn't go down there after the accident because I knew it was extremely dangerous. One of my colleagues at The Voice, Paul Cowan, did go down there. He died of cancer when he was, I think, 38. I remember when he came into the paper and his hair was quite white, and he said, I have cancer. And when I was down there about 5 years after the accident, they read a roll call of, I think, 30 reporters who had died, who had been there.
I think Jimmy Carter knew a lot more than he said. He had to have known more because he knew enough to be a nuclear engineer, so he certainly did know. On the other hand, he was keeping the secrets of the military. I don't know whether he will ever speak out, but Rickover, the head of the nuclear submarine fleet, challenged the administration on their handling of 3 Mile Island. I think if you visit that site, you'll see an island in the middle of the Susquehanna River, and on either side there are very high hills. I hesitate to call them mountains, but they're pretty high. And the 3 Mile Island plant is down in this valley. So when the radioactive cloud was released, it actually hit the side of the mountain so that the people who were living there were really in the radioactive cloud, and they did have serious health effects in that area. However, when they asked for a study, they were given a study which was ridiculous from the point of view of health. They drew circles around the plant, and they looked at people in each of those concentric circles to see if there was any difference in health. Well, actually, if you were really looking for health problems, you'd look downwind for anything from due to airborne particles, and you'd look downstream for anything that was dumped into the river. And what he found was what you would expect. People were more fearful as they got closer to the reactor. So he blamed the problems, health problems, on fear, and he blamed the media for making people afraid. It was a setup. This is not what happened, and many people were damaged. There were about 2,000 cases for physical harm that were in the courts, and they kept out of the court. They dismissed about 12 expert witnesses who were physicians, oncologists, botanists, biologists, and so on, by saying they were not the expertise. And when the judge saw all the expert witnesses of the civilians dismissed from the court, she just dismissed the whole case. So none of these 2,000 cases ever made it into a U.S. court. It was an outrageous situation.
My husband died 7 years ago. His diagnosis was cancer of the lungs. They were still denying that there was any fallout, but my brother was in his backyard, and he came into the house and he became very nauseated and started to have a vomiting session. And this was about, I imagine, about 2 hours after the first big cloud came up. About 4 years later, he died.
That particular morning, we walked along the river. Apparently, that was that morning that they were experiencing the problems. Obviously, we didn't know that at that time. Shortly after my basketball season of my sophomore year of college, toward the end of the season, I started to physically just feel like I didn't have the stamina. There were 1 or 2 games I was playing in where I literally asked the coach to take me out of the game because it just physically didn't feel right. I started to develop a skin rash or skin lesions, and just could not keep the food down, and could just generally was not doing real well at that point. That's when we came back to Harrisburg, and I checked into the Harrisburg Hospital at that point for some tests to see what was going on. And then once they determined that, the high school was within 5 miles, I was evacuated from the high school, our house was in that area, then I think they started to put 2 to 2 together. I feel that from a basketball perspective, it robbed me of probably the greatest period of time in my life.
For 40 years, the American people have been told, don't worry, nuclear power plants are safe. In fact, the electricity is too cheap to meter, and that radiation should be measured in sunshine units. Radiation is so beneficial, it's the giver of life. The sun itself is a fusion reactor. We owe it all to nuclear energy. Now we know that it was really poison power. Now we know that because of the Cold War and because of the propaganda from the utilities, that nuclear power plants have in fact been seeping radioactive poisons into our backyards. Now we know that there has been a cover-up with regards to what could happen in a catastrophic accident, and also what happens in the everyday emissions coming from a nuclear power plant. Now we know, now that the Cold War is over, now that we know that documents are being declassified, we begin to realize that the American people, in some sense, were guinea pigs for the nuclear industry. We now know that the military used to do experiments by releasing low-level amounts of radiation into people's backyard. In Cincinnati, 2 million pounds of uranium dust were emitted into the area to see how far radiation would follow follow the wind pattern. In New Mexico, again, radioactive materials at a very low level were dispersed into the environment just to see what would happen in case of a nuclear war. Now we know the American people were used as guinea pigs for the nuclear industry.
The nuclear power plants were wanted primarily as a front for the military industry, since they needed so much cooperation, not only the cooperation of the general public, but they needed universities who would teach nuclear engineering and nuclear physics. And you know, a university is not going to carry a subject if the only job opportunity is to make weapons of mass production. So they had no way to get new engineers and physicists into their industry unless they had a commercial front.
There is a structure of how the real truth about radiation is covered up among government agencies. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, of course, is the federal agency that licenses reactors. They're the ones that sets the, quote, safe, permissible limits of exposure and continues to license reactors. However, working in conjunction with the NRC are the state and local health departments, public health departments, who are in fact mandated to protect people, the American people, from harmful exposures from radiation and other chemicals. And in every case, in every state, in every county in which our radiation research group has presented findings, we are rebutted by the local county health department in every case. Their standard line is that these levels of radiation coming out of nuclear reactors are low. In fact, so low that they cannot possibly cause human disease.
Sometimes when we look at the old Atomic Energy Commission or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we see the same names coming up over and over again. These are the people that have worked for the commercial nuclear power industry, then worked for the government, and many people think it's like the goats guarding the cabbage patch. They are the same people. We have musical chairs within the nuclear industry. Musical chairs for people going from the government to commercial interests to the military and back into the government. We call this the nuclear priesthood. There is a high priesthood of these nuclear officials who think they know everything, and because of the Cold War ideology, they were blinded to the fact that low-level radiation is much more dangerous than they thought. They were blinded to the real impact that nuclear energy has had on the United States, where we have nuclear waste dumps that are rotting, polluting the surface of the earth. This nuclear priesthood got us into trouble. The solution to the problem is democracy. Why not let the light of democracy light up the shadows, light up the shadowy world of nuclear secrecy, this world where national security is used to cover up all sorts of dirty tricks.
The average scientist tends to work now for corporate America, and they often sign documents saying they can't release or expose what they're up to, or they might lose their job if they did.
The nuclear industry is one of the more powerful industries in this country. It involves utilities who run nuclear plants. It involves companies like Westinghouse and General Electric who manufacture plants. These are not small companies. They are well established. They do other, they're involved in other fields as well, and they certainly have been very politically active for a very long time. And as a result, because of the contributions that these companies give to political candidates, politicians are very lax to speak out about the potential hazards of low-level radiation. Most congressmen will either deny it or will just remain on the sidelines and remain silent.
When you look at the history of nuclear power plants, the industry says, here are our books. They show conclusively that there have been no major releases of radiation, that accidents have not been covered up, and that we run nuclear power plants successfully and safely. However, when you look between the lines and you take a look at the real history behind these plants, you realize that there have been a number of near misses with regards to accidents, plus We have the routine kinds of emissions from nuclear power plants that then pervades our backyards, that get into our homes without our permission. We now know the nuclear power plants have leaked out radiation where the operators would simply not own up to the true levels of radiation coming out of the reactor. And I think this is the height of medical irresponsibility, that these operators have tried to cover up their own accident history and their own safety. For example, take a look at the simple issue of how safe a nuclear power plant is when it's operating. The NRC did an experiment once. They took a loaded gun, they sealed it in plastic and put it in a suitcase, and they wanted to know how far a person could wander on a nuclear power plant site with a loaded gun before he was apprehended. It turns out that this test official went all the way to the control room, where he opened up his suitcase and took out a loaded gun encased in plastic so it couldn't do any damage. This goes to show you the lax conditions that exist with regards to security and also with regards to routine emissions of radiation from nuclear power plants.
The owners operators of nuclear power plants, Entergy, who owns and operates Indian Point, for instance, tells us that the containment domes are robust structures which would be able to repel a large airplane crashing into those. There is a relevant Nuclear Regulatory Commission study which we need to be talking about. That's the October 2000 study, which found that 1 out of 2 commercially flying airplanes today is able to penetrate 5-foot thick reinforced concrete 45% of the time. Now, if you think of that and you realize that the containment dome at Indian Point, which is one of the thicker domes in the country, is 6 to 7 feet thick at the base and only 3.5 feet thick at the top, you realize just how susceptible to a large plane our nuclear power plants are.
Almost nothing is being done to minimize the damage that could be caused by a terrorist attack at Indian Point. And that's the horrible and painful truth. What the government is doing, instead of increasing security or dealing with the real problems of evacuation, is dealing with essentially a dishonest approach to the people in that surrounding community. They're doing two things. They're saying, well, look, here's a pill. It's called potassium iodide, and it will block the uptake of radioactive iodine in the thyroid. It doesn't deal with other kinds of radiation, cesium, strontium, the other things that would be released. And it certainly doesn't deal with the problems of evacuating the area once there's an accident.
If there is a meltdown at Indian Point, not only will there be epidemics of leukemia and cancer years later, many males will be rendered sterile, many permanently. Thousands of women will stop menstruating, many permanently. Babies in utero will be born with tiny little heads because the developing brain is so sensitive to radiation, microcephaly, permanently retarded. Thousands more babies will be born as cretins as their thyroid gland is destroyed, imperative for the growth of neurons. So we're talking about, and then there'll be genetic disease passed down through future generations of the descendants of the survivors. This is absolutely, medically speaking, the most horrendous situation that anyone could possibly imagine. Doctors spend all our lives trying to cure cancer, and we nearly kill our patients to cure them, you know, it's dreadful. And yet we don't say anything, the medical profession, really. We don't stand as a body to condemn the nuclear industry, and for that I condemn my colleagues. And it's time that they got going to work on prevention of cancer, not just trying to cure it.
Right now, our attempt to measure strontium-90 in baby teeth is the only such effort going on. But 40 years ago, when Barry Commoner started to collect his St. Louis baby teeth, every major country in the world initiated a baby teeth project and got the same results that we got here, showing that the strontium-90 levels reached a peak in 1963 and then went down. But today, there's no other country that's doing that. In the United States, what happened was that in 1970, the Nixon administration terminated the first baby teeth project because they felt that the decline from 1965 to 1970 meant that the danger was over. We're finding, however, that the danger is not over, that it's now recurring.
We've published 3 articles in the medical literature about our findings. The biggest finding is that on Long Island in New York, where we've collected almost 600 teeth, the trends in childhood cancer and the trends in strontium-90 are the same. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. This is quite strong evidence that there is in fact a cause and effect linkage between the two.
The Tooth Fairy Project is a project that has been conducted by the Radiation and Public Health Project, which is an independent group of scientists and researchers, where they are collecting baby teeth from various parts of the country and measuring strontium-90 in the baby teeth. And we're finding now strontium-90 levels in the baby teeth of children living near nuclear facilities that are as high as they were during above-the-ground testing in the 1950s. And strontium-90 only comes from nuclear explosions and nuclear power plants, and the above-the-ground testing ended in 1963. So the increase that we're seeing in strontium-90 in baby teeth in children living near nuclear reactors can only be coming from the reactors themselves.
More to come next week. I'll see you then.